I've always been drawn to the eerie, the unexplained. As a writer, it's my bread and butter, finding the strange in the mundane, digging up secrets that should have stayed buried. But nothing could have prepared me for what I found in that little beach town. It started as a local rumor, the kind of thing that you might overhear at a coffee shop or read in a late-night forum. A young boy, playing alone on the beach, stumbled upon something strange. At first, it was just an odd sensation, the sand shifting beneath his feet as if it were alive. But then, as he dug deeper, the sand began to bleed. That's right, bleed. As if he had sliced open a vein in the earth itself. The boy's mother didn't believe him at first. Who would? But when she saw the red-stained sand, sticky and warm as fresh blood, she screamed and yanked him away, rushing him to the town's only clinic. The doctor couldn't explain it. There were no cuts or wounds on the boy, but the blood was real enough, staining his clothes, his shoes, even his hands. Word spread quickly after that. In a town that's small, secrets don't last long. By the next morning, the beach was swarming with people, curious locals, eager tourists, even a few reporters sniffing around for a story. It didn't take long for the scientists to arrive, all serious faces and equipment, poking and prodding at the sand, trying to make sense of the impossible. I got wind of the story a few days later. I was in need of a break from the city, and a beach sounded like the perfect escape. But when I heard about the bleeding sand, I knew I had to go. This was the kind of story that didn't just get under your skin, it burrowed into your bones, refusing to let go until you uncovered every last, grisly detail. I arrived in town late one afternoon, the sun dipping low in the sky, casting long shadows over the narrow streets. The place had a quaint charm, the kind of town where everyone knew everyone else, where time seemed to move a little slower. But there was an undercurrent of tension, a fear that clung to the air like the scent of salt water. The beach was easy enough to find. Just follow the crowd, I thought, and I wasn't wrong. Even in the fading light, there were people milling about, staring at the patch of sand that had caused all the commotion. The area was cordoned off with yellow tape, but that didn't stop the onlookers from craning their necks, trying to catch a glimpse of the strange phenomenon. I pushed my way through the crowd, flashing my press badge to the officer standing guard. He eyed me suspiciously but stepped aside, allowing me to slip under the tape. The sand looked normal enough at first glance, just a small patch about the size of a dinner table. But as I bent down to inspect it, I noticed something unusual. The sand wasn't just wet. It was slick like oil, and a deep crimson color that darkened as I disturbed it. I reached out to touch it, half expecting the sand to move beneath my fingers, but it was solid enough. Cold too, despite the warm evening air. I scooped up a handful, letting it trickle through my fingers, and felt a strange unease settle over me. This wasn't right. The blood didn't just stain the sand, it seemed to seep into it, as if the earth itself was bleeding, an open wound that refused to heal. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept returning to the sand, to the way it had felt in my hand, the cold, clammy sensation that lingered long after I'd washed it off. I kept hearing the whispers of the crowd, the locals murmuring about the boy, about the blood. Some said it was a hoax, a publicity stunt to draw in tourists, but others spoke of something darker, an ancient curse, they said, a forgotten ritual, performed by a civilization long since vanished. They whispered of a mass grave, buried deep beneath the sand, a resting place for the victims of a bloodthirsty god. And now, with the sand disturbed, the blood was rising to the surface, a warning from the past. I told myself it was just a story, a tall tale spun by frightened minds. But the next day, when I returned to the beach, I found that the patch of bleeding sand had grown. It was nearly twice the size now, the crimson stain spreading like a disease. And the smell, oh God, the smell, was enough to turn your stomach. It wasn't just the metallic tang of blood anymore. It was rot, decay, the scent of something long dead and buried clawing its way to the surface. The scientists were baffled, their instruments failing to provide any answers. They took samples, sent them off to labs, but the results were inconclusive. There was nothing in the sand, they said, nothing that could explain the blood, the smell. It was as if the earth itself had become corrupted, infected by some ancient evil, and the people, those who had touched the sand, who had come into contact with it were changing. The boy was the first. He started having nightmares, vivid, terrifying dreams of a time long past, of strange figures chanting in a language no one could understand. His mother said he would wake up screaming, his sheets soaked in sweat, his eyes wild with fear. And then the sickness started. It began with a fever, high and relentless, burning through him like wildfire. His skin turned pale, almost translucent, his veins standing out like blue rivers beneath the surface. And then came the visions, horrifying, inexplicable images that he would draw compulsively, his small hands shaking as he scribbled on paper. Dark figures, standing in a circle, their faces hidden, their hands raised in worship to something vast and terrible. Others who had touched the sand began to show similar symptoms. Fevers, hallucinations, a creeping madness that took hold and wouldn't let go. They spoke of voices, whispers that came to them in the night, urging them to return to the beach, to dig deeper, to uncover what lay beneath. I tried to stay away, I really did, but the story had its hooks in me, and I couldn't resist the pull. I returned to the beach, night after night, watching as the patch of bleeding sand grew, as the sickness spread through the town like a plague. The scientists, the doctors, they were helpless, their knowledge useless against whatever ancient horror had been awakened. And then one night I saw it. I had been standing at the edge of the beach, the wind cold and sharp against my skin, when I noticed movement beneath the sand. At first, I thought it was just the light playing tricks on me, the shifting shadows cast by the moon. But then the sand began to stir, to ripple as if something beneath it was trying to break free. I watched in horror as a hand, a skeletal, rotting hand, pushed through the surface, clawing its way into the open air. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe as more hands followed, pulling themselves out of the sand, their bones clacking together, covered in that same dark, wet sand that bled. They weren't just hands, they were bodies, skeletal remains of those long forgotten, sacrificed in the name of an ancient god. And they were angry, so angry. The figures rose from the sand, their empty eye sockets fixed on me, their jaws opening in silent screams. I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet, my heart pounding in my chest as they began to move toward me, slowly, deliberately, as if they had all the time in the world. I turned and ran, the sound of shifting sand and clattering bones echoing behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the town, breathless and shaking, my mind reeling with the horror of what I had seen. But it didn't end there. The next morning the beach was empty. The patch of bleeding sand had spread even further, now encompassing nearly the entire shoreline. And the bodies, the skeletons, they were gone, vanished as if they had never been there. But I knew what was coming. The town was dying. The curse was reawakening, the ancient ritual unfinished, the blood debt unpaid, and there was nothing any of us could do to stop it. As I sit here writing this, I can feel the fever taking hold. My skin is pale, my hands trembling. The visions are starting, the whispers growing louder. They're calling me back to the beach, back to the blood-soaked sand, to finish what was started centuries ago. I don't know how much time I have left, but I know one thing for certain. The bleeding beach is hungry. And it won't stop until it's been fed. I've always loved the sea. There's something about the endless expanse of water that calls to me, a siren song that I've never been able to resist. I've been diving for most of my life, exploring the depths, hunting for sunken treasures and forgotten relics. The ocean has always been my sanctuary, a place where I can escape the noise of the world above. But lately, that love has turned to something darker, something I can't quite shake. It started with the stories. A shipwreck from centuries ago, a vessel that went down in a storm so fierce it shattered the sky and split the sea open. The wreck lay just off the coast of a popular tourist beach, its location well known to the locals and thrill-seeking divers alike. Over the years, it had become a sort of macabre attraction, a place where people went to test their nerves and maybe find a piece of history to take home. I'd explored the wreck more times than I could count. I knew every twisted beam, every rusted relic of the ship that once was. The stories of ghosts, of spirits trapped in the watery grave, were just that, stories. I never paid them much mind. But then the rumors started. Divers were coming back from the wreck, pale and shaken, with tales of ghostly figures drifting through the water, their faces contorted in agony, reaching out as if begging for help. At first I dismissed it as nothing more than the usual exaggeration, fear playing tricks on their minds. But then one diver didn't come back at all. The town was on edge after that, whispers of curses and vengeful spirits spreading like wildfire. No one wanted to go near the wreck, not even the bravest of the divers. That's when they called me. I was the seasoned one, the local who knew the waters better than anyone. If anyone could retrieve the body, it was me. I didn't hesitate. A man was missing, and it was my job to bring him back. I gathered my gear, checked everything twice, and headed out before dawn. The sea was calm that morning, the water like glass as the sun began to rise, casting a golden glow over the surface. But beneath that calm I could feel it, the tension, the unease that had settled over the town like a shroud. I arrived at the site just as the first light of day touched the water. The wreck was easy to find, its twisted remains visible even from the surface. I strapped on my gear, did a final check, and then slipped into the water, the familiar chill of the ocean wrapping around me like an old friend. As I descended, the wreck came into view, its once proud hull now a skeleton of rusted metal and decayed wood. I felt a pang of sorrow as I always did, imagining the lives lost when the ship went down, the terror they must have felt as the water rushed in, sealing their fate. The water was unusually clear that day, the visibility perfect as I moved through the wreck, searching for any sign of the missing diver. It didn't take long to find him. He was caught in the twisted remains of the ship's rigging, his body limp, his eyes wide open in a frozen stare. But there was something wrong, something that made my blood run cold. His face was contorted, twisted in an expression of pure terror, his mouth open in a silent scream. His hands were outstretched, as if trying to ward off something, but there was nothing there. Just the cold, empty water. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I'd seen death before countless times, but this was different. This was wrong. As I reached out to free him from the wreckage, I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow drifting just beyond the edge of my vision. I turned, expecting to see a fish or maybe another diver, but there was nothing, just the wreck, silent and still. I shook it off, focusing on the task at hand. I needed to get him out of there, to bring him back to the surface. But as I worked, I felt it again, that sensation of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight. The water seemed to grow colder, the light dimming as if the sun had been blotted out. And then I saw them. They appeared slowly, their forms emerging from the shadows, ghostly figures drifting through the water. At first, I thought they were just a trick of the light, an illusion caused by my mind playing tricks on me. But as they drew closer, I could see them clearly, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes empty voids that seemed to pull at me, drawing me in. They were the crew, the drowned ones. Their bodies were skeletal, their flesh rotted away by time and the sea, but their eyes, those empty, haunting eyes, were filled with a desperation, a longing that sent waves of fear crashing over me. They reached out, their hands moving through the water with a slow, deliberate grace, as if they were moving through air rather than the depths. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I knew I should move, should swim away as fast as I could, but I couldn't. I was rooted to the spot, held captive by those empty eyes, by the sorrow and rage that seemed to emanate from them. The water around me grew colder, the pressure building as if the sea itself was closing in, crushing me under its weight. I could feel it in my bones, the ancient anger, the betrayal of lives cut short, of souls trapped in the abyss, unable to find peace. They were angry, and they wanted me to join them. One of the figures drifted closer, its hand outstretched, the bones thin and brittle, yet somehow strong. I could see the remnants of a uniform, the tatters of what had once been a proud captain's coat. The face was little more than a skull, the teeth bared in a grotesque grin. But those eyes, those damn eyes, held me fast. I tried to pull away, to swim to the surface, but my body wouldn't respond. The cold seeped into my veins, numbing my limbs, slowing my thoughts. I could feel them all around me now, their hands brushing against my skin, tugging at my gear, pulling me down. The wreck was their tomb, and I was their offering. Just as I felt myself slipping into the darkness, the cold consuming me, I heard something, a voice distant and faint, but growing louder. It was calling my name, pulling me back from the edge, filling my mind with a warmth that chased away the cold. I forced myself to move, to break free from the grip of the drowned ones. It was like swimming through molasses, every movement a struggle, but I managed to push away, to kick toward the surface. The light above seemed impossibly far, a distant star in an endless night, but I focused on it, driving myself upward, away from the cold, grasping hands. I broke the surface with a gasp, the sunlight blinding as it struck my eyes. I ripped off my mask, sucking in deep breaths of air, the warmth of the sun a balm against the chill that still clung to me. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I knew they were still down there, waiting, watching, their hollow eyes fixed on me, their hands reaching out, longing to drag me back down to join them in their eternal prison. I made it back to shore, my limbs trembling, my heart still racing with fear. The townsfolk were waiting for me, their faces filled with a mix of hope and dread. But when they saw the look in my eyes, they knew. I didn't have to say a word. The diver was gone, his body claimed by the sea, taken by the spirits of the wreck, and I knew deep down that it was only a matter of time before they came for me too. The ocean was no longer my sanctuary. It had become a place of terror, a haunted graveyard where the dead walked, their souls trapped in the cold, dark depths. And they wouldn't rest until they had claimed the living to join them. Now I can't escape the nightmares. I see them every night, their empty eyes staring at me, their hands reaching out, pulling me down into the darkness. I hear their voices, whispers that grow louder with each passing day, calling me back to the wreck, back to the place where they wait. I know I won't be able to resist for long. The sea is calling me, the drowned ones demanding their sacrifice. And when the time comes, I will answer, because there is no escaping the ocean's grasp. Once it has you, it never lets go. The first time I heard about the beach, I laughed it off as just another local ghost story, the kind they tell to tourists to keep them from wandering too far off the beaten path. A beach that hums, and not just any hum, an eerie melodic sound that beckons you, lures you in like a moth to a flame. The locals called it the siren's call. They warned everyone to stay away after dusk, whispering about the fates of those who didn't listen. But I'm not the kind to scare easily. My name is Daniel Harlan, and I'm a musician. I've spent years chasing unique sounds, traveling the world to find inspiration in the most unusual places. So when I heard about this beach and its strange haunting hum, I knew I had to go. After all, I've always been drawn to the mysterious, the things that can't be explained. The beach was remote, a good 2-hour drive from the nearest town. The road there twisted through dense, dark woods that seemed to press in on either side, as if the trees were trying to push me back. By the time I reached the coast, the sun was already dipping low in the sky, painting the horizon in hues of blood red and deep orange. The beach itself was a stretch of dark sand, bordered by jagged rocks that jutted out into the ocean like broken teeth. The wind was cold, carrying the scent of salt and something else, a faint, sweet smell that I couldn't quite place. As I stood there, setting up my recording equipment, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. But there was no one around. Just me, the sea, and the creeping dusk. I set up my microphone on a small tripod, making sure it was secure before pulling out my guitar. I tuned it carefully, the familiar ritual calming my nerves. The stories I'd heard about this place kept replaying in my mind, but I pushed them aside. I was here for the sound, nothing more. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, the hum began. At first it was so faint I thought I was imagining it, a low, almost imperceptible vibration that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I strained to hear it, adjusting the levels on my recorder, but it was elusive, slipping away the moment I tried to focus on it. Then suddenly it grew louder, filling the air with a rich, resonant tone that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It wasn't just a hum anymore. It was a melody soft and sweet, like a lullaby sung by a distant voice. I felt it vibrating in my chest, pulling at something deep inside me. I glanced at the water and froze. There, just beneath the surface, were shapes, vague, translucent figures that moved with the current, their outlines shimmering in the twilight. I couldn't make out any details, but they were unmistakably human. My heart began to race, a chill creeping up my spine, but I didn't stop, I couldn't. Instead, I did the only thing that made sense to me in that moment. I began to play. My fingers moved over the strings of my guitar, coaxing out a melody that matched the haunting hum. The moment I started playing, the figures in the water grew more distinct, rising closer to the surface. Their movements synchronized with the rhythm of my music. I should have been terrified, but I wasn't. There was something in the music, in that strange, hypnotic hum, that soothed my fear, made me feel calm, safe. Even I played on, the melody flowing through me, my fingers moving of their own accord, as if guided by an unseen force. The figures in the water were clearer now. I could see faces, pale, ghostly faces with hollow eyes that stared up at me, their expressions unreadable. They weren't just moving with the current. They were dancing, swaying in time with the music. And then, as if in response to my playing, they began to sing. Their voices rose up from the water, joining the hum in a haunting harmony that wrapped around me like a thick fog. It was beautiful, in a way that sent shivers down my spine. The song was sad, filled with longing and despair, yet I couldn't stop listening. I didn't want to stop. As the tide began to rise, the figures drifted closer to the shore, their voices growing louder, more insistent. I was dimly aware of the water lapping at my feet, but it didn't matter. Nothing mattered except the music, the melody that I had become a part of. It was as if the sea itself was calling to me, urging me to join them, and I wanted to. God help me, I wanted to. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, breaking the spell for just a moment. I looked down at my hands, still playing, and tried to stop, but I couldn't. My fingers wouldn't obey me, wouldn't stop moving. The music had taken control, and I was powerless against it. I tried to pull away, to step back from the water, but my legs wouldn't move. The figures were closer now, their faces clearer, more distinct. They were all around me, their eyes fixed on mine, their mouths open in that haunting, inescapable song. I was sinking. The water was up to my knees, then my waist. I could feel it pulling me down, dragging me into the depths. Panic surged through me, but it was drowned out by the music, by the irresistible pull of the melody. The figures reached out to me, their cold, translucent hands brushing against my skin, and I felt a terrible, overwhelming sense of peace. The last thing I saw before I went under was the darkening sky, the first stars flickering into existence as the night took hold. The music swelled, filling my ears, my mind, my soul, and then everything went black. When I woke, I was still on the beach, the sun rising over the horizon. My guitar lay beside me, the strings wet and tangled, the wood warped from the seawater. My recording equipment was gone, swallowed by the tide. The beach was empty, the figures gone, as if they had never been there. But the hum remained, faint, distant, but unmistakable. It echoed in my mind, in my very bones, a melody I knew I would never be able to escape. The locals found me wandering the beach later that day, dazed and shivering. They didn't ask what happened. They knew. They knew. They'd seen it before, countless times. They just shook their heads, their faces grim, and took me back to the town. I left that place as soon as I could, but the hum followed me. It's with me even now as I sit in my apartment, trying to write this down. I can hear it in the silence, in the spaces between my thoughts, a constant reminder of what happened on that cursed beach. And I know deep down that it's only a matter of time before I go back, because the song isn't finished, and neither am I.